remember that Socrates asks that we divide this line disproportionately. So we'll make the top half about 2/3 the length of the bottom. And again, divide the remaining sections by that same proportion. Why do you think he asks us to divide it disproportionately?
Because the intellectual is more important?
Yes, all right? The larger space devoted to the realm of ideas or forms and to the intelligible versus the visible, respectively, does not represent a quantitative difference, but a qualitative one. Okay? The greater proportion of the line represented by the intelligible realm is intended to represent a greater share in reality, okay? More real or more perfect. And of course, we must remember that this representation of the structure of reality is to be understood in terms of the basic analogy between the sun and the good. Just as the sun gives visibility to things that we see, the good provides intelligibility or thinkability to the things thought. All right? Of course, the good, as the ultimate metaphysical principle, provides illumination and origination to the entire hierarchy, including the visible realm. Okay? But for purposes of understanding what Plato means by the good plays the same role in the intelligible realm that the sun plays in the visible realm. And so far, what we've established is that the visible realm consists of images and the physical objects which cast them. And again, there are a number of ways in which I can express this metaphysical relationship to you, such as images are made possible by physical objects, which means the same thing as saying that images are grounded in physical objects or transcended by physical objects. The physical object makes the image possible. And so, in order to know, given two things, which one is more fundamental or more real, we can ask which can exist without the other. And certainly, the physical object can exist whether it casts a shadow or not. But a shadow cannot exist without the object to cast it. Everybody with me? All right. And the sun rules, as it were, over this entire realm. And it does so in two ways. The first is as a principle of origination. The earth and everything in it is created of stardust. Okay? And natural things are nourished by the sun. Okay? But at the same time, it is that nourishment provided by the sun that illuminates those things. Okay? So, the sun allows the tree to grow, but also allows it to be seen. So now when we discuss the intelligible realm, we should carry that metaphor forth. The good gives rise to mathematical relations, but in some way also allows them to be understood. And that's the mysterious metaphysical question that we have to ask. Okay? So just as we've established the metaphysical primacy of physical objects over their images, we have established that physical objects presuppose mathematical relationships. Or mathematics. And we talked about this. There are a number of ways, I think, in which we can make sense of this. Whether it's in terms of how many protons belong to the nucleus of an atom, or the atomic structure of a molecule, or the measurements of a physical object. There are many ways in which the existence of the physical world and the diversity of things which comprise this physical world can be explained numerically or mathematically. Okay? And I had mentioned at one point that Plato is a great systematizer. And if we think back to his predecessors, the first metaphysicians, Pythagoras, for one, sought to explain the entire world in terms of numbers. Okay? So Plato accommodates his thinking here. Likewise, for Plato, the visible realm, anything which can be accessed with our senses, is constantly changing. We live in a world of flux. Things come into existence, they mature, and then they pass out of existence. And the view that all things are constantly changing, that nothing stays the same, was the central view of Heraclitus, another pre-Socratic philosopher. Okay. Now keep in mind that as we pass from the visible realm, or the physical, into the intelligible realm, or the metaphysical, where meta means beyond, we are also passing out of the domain of space and time, because mathematical relations and the forms are timeless. They are not corrupted by space or time. And even if there were no spaces, it would still be true. For example, that the whole is greater than the part, or that a thing is always identical to itself, or 2 points describe a line, okay? All of which are Euclidean axioms. They have eternal validity. So if images are made possible by physical objects, and physical objects are in some way made possible by mathematics, the final question is, what grounds mathematics? what makes mathematical relationships possible? Or what do mathematical relationships reflect? And Plato's answer is the perfection of the good, or the forms. Okay? Now, I'll just write forms here and put the good in parentheses, because I think there is quite a bit of scholarship and confusion over the relationship between the good and the forms, or sometimes when the forms are called ideas. Okay? But perhaps the easiest way to think about it is simply this. Like any scientist, Plato is attempting to make sense of plurality by reducing it to something simpler. The holy grail of theoretical physics would be to explain the entire universe in terms of a single equation. So I might have a single object casting numerous shadows. Or I may have numerous physical objects, like all of these desks, each of which is a reflection of the same mathematical relationship. But ultimately, the totality of mathematics is in some way a reflection of the eternal perfection of the good. But we can't talk directly about the good, because we really don't know what it is. Okay? To put it in more familiar terms, for me to tell you exactly what the good is like would be the equivalent of telling you exactly what the mind of God is like. And truth be told, just as Plato, in some places, is willing to admit that he doesn't know whether forms exist, I'm perfectly willing to admit that I don't know whether God exists, let alone being capable of telling you the content of the divine mind. Okay? However, because we do know that the good is being used as the origin of all ideas, and by extension, all physical things, when I talk about the form of justice, or the form of courage, or the form of temperance, or the form of beauty, I'm talking about these ideas in their absolute nature, their essential nature. Okay? What any philosopher wants to understand is what it essentially means to be. What is the essence of justice? What is it that makes that which is just an example of justice? What's the essence? What's the indispensable qualification for a thing to count as just, or temperate, or beautiful? But ultimately remember that because the good is outside of space and time, it does not admit of plurality. There's no principle of individuation. Strictly speaking, it is a logical error to speak of many forms, because the concept of many requires mathematics. Now, I've got mathematics in the intelligible realm. So I suppose that's okay. What I don't have are space and time. So that would suggest that mathematics transcends space and time. But how do I do mathematics without time? This is a problem we'll encounter when we look at Immanuel Kant. You see that slip? Immanuel Kant. Talking about numbers. Okay. So back to this main issue here. Perhaps you can think of it like this. Beauty, or absolute beauty, the essence of beauty, is but a single facet of the good. The essence of justice, essence of courage, the essence of temperance are but facets of the good. And of course, we can only think and speak in terms of our language. And ours is a subject-object language. Thinking itself is temporal. And Socrates has already acknowledged the difficulty here when he has said, I cannot explain to you what the good is like. Not because I'm not smart enough, but because it's impossible. Because you're asking me to explain something which is eternal and unchanging in terms of a form of communication which is not eternal or unchanging. Okay. So we've got the visible realm, we've got the intelligible realm. And what's very important to remember is that these relations, the relation between images and physical objects, is the same relation that obtains between mathematics and the forms. And that same relation is contained in the proportion of the visible realm to the intelligible realm. So images are to physical objects as mathematics are to forms, as the visible realm is to the intelligible realm. These are ratio relations. Okay? Images possess the same share of their physical objects that mathematics possess of the forms, as the entire visible realm possesses of the intelligible. And of course, there must be some variation if it's possible for me to rank things in the visible realm. Some images are better than other images. But an image as an image is removed from the essence of a physical object by the same proportion that physical objects are removed from the essence of mathematics. Now, almost as an afterthought, in the very last paragraph, I think, of Book 6. Socrates says, and now I want you to realize that for each level of reality, and of course, this entire side of the divided line is metaphysical. Is a corresponding power of the mind which apprehends or seeks to grasp that level of reality. To complement our metaphysics, I must also have an epistemology. Okay. So to start us off, and again, he does this very quickly, he says, the power of the mind, which corresponds to images, is what he calls belief. Is that what your translation uses? Okay. So, to speak sort of loosely, I see a shadow on the ground, and I say, I believe there's a person walking behind me. Okay? And if I turn around and I see the person, the physical object, okay, then I have something more than belief. I've got a very strong belief. Okay? I know what a person is, and I can person. And so Plato uses a stronger word to represent that sort of belief, like conviction. Okay? Because after all, images can be deceptive. Okay? But when I'm looking square onto a physical object, I have a very strong belief. I'm very convicted of the physical world. And of course, according to Plato, over-convicted. What's a conviction? It's a very strongly held belief, right? And if you ask the ordinary person who has not read any Plato, what are you most sure about? They will say this stuff. Physical world. Okay? I am of the conviction that what is most real are the things I can touch and see. Plato, of course, is trying to teach us that anything we can touch and see is but a reflection, a dim shadow of something more real, something non-physical altogether, a realm of ideas. So, if belief and conviction are the faculties of mind corresponding to images and physical objects, okay, they are both, strictly speaking, not forms of knowledge. Because I cannot know something which isn't real, right? Or true. If I were to say, I know that 1 + 1 = 4, that would be an abuse of the term knowledge. Okay? And so I cannot really say that even a true belief constitutes knowledge. Right? Like, if I say, I believe that it's raining outside right now, even if that is a true belief, I cannot say that I know it. Because knowledge requires something in addition to a true belief. It requires an explanation of how I know. Okay? So, these modes of apprehension, the faculty of mind that receives images, the faculty of mind that receives physical objects, are both forms of opinion. Okay? For Plato, if the object of my thinking is something in the visible realm, and therefore not ultimately real, then it cannot be the object of knowledge. It must be the object of opinion. So I say, look, here are a bunch of triangles, okay? And I am convicted of the belief that these are triangles. But until I understand what it really means to be a triangle, in other words, until I grasp the mathematics of triangularity, such that I can say it is a three-sided closed figure consisting of 180 degrees, only then can I say that I actually understand what it means to be a triangle. And that is what Plato calls the faculty of mind that seizes upon mathematics, understanding. I may be able to recognize what a thing is, but strictly speaking, if physical objects are all just reflections of a mathematical relationship, then I do not properly understand these physical objects until I grasp their inner mathematical structure. Okay? But of course, I can't ever fully understand the good. I'll never know exactly what the form of justice is, what the form of courage is. And I'll certainly, not as long as I'm in human form, know what the good is. And so, the term he uses for our pursuit of an understanding of the good is dialectic. Philosophical inquiry. The most I can do is investigate rationally and hope to get a better grasp of the good through that conversational method, which Plato calls dialectic, or Socrates calls the elenchus. Okay? But as belief and conviction are just forms of opinion, understanding and dialectic are forms of knowledge. Certainly, when I understand that a triangle has a mathematical reality, then I know what it means to be a triangle. And I suppose you might say something like this. When I come to accept that the human mind, as it is, can never have a perfect grasp of the good, but must content itself as limited by what the dialectical method can uncover, that is a form of knowing too. It is knowing the limitations of human understanding. Okay? All right. So that is the divided line. Sometimes you'll see it represented vertically instead of horizontally. I prefer to put it this way because what we're attempting is an ascent. Okay? And the last image he asks us to consider is the cave. Okay? And this is probably one of the most enduring and well-known stories in Plato, the Allegory of the cave. Okay? And I'm going to have to do it up here. To make it visible to our online friends. Okay. So somebody tell me, what is the cave all about? How does Socrates introduce this story?
Metaphor?
It's a metaphor, just like the line is a metaphor and the sun is a metaphor. And it is a metaphor for what?
People in the dark seeing things, perceiving as such, not believing nothing else but what they see.
Okay, those are the elements of the cave.
Or the difference between the intelligible and the...
All of that, okay? But to boil it down, Socrates says, this is a story of us. This is a representation of human nature and the process of learning. Okay? This is essentially Plato's theory of education and how it's possible for a person to ascend these levels of reality. Okay? So we're asked to imagine what? An underground denizen, a cave. Okay? And what's going on in this cave here?
Not in prison. These guys are chained up.
Yeah.
Facing a wall.
Right, so we've got a cave wall over here, right? And in some fashion, there are people bound to a tree trunk or something, facing the wall.
And they can't.
And they cannot move. They cannot turn their heads. And they've been there forever. Okay? Now remember, this is a metaphor. Plato's not saying that this ever happened. He's trying to teach us something. This is like a parable. So here are these people facing the cave wall, and what are they looking at?
Shadow.
Shadows. Okay? All kinds of shadows. Shadows of anything that you might encounter in the world. Trees, flowers, desks, chairs, couches, houses, whatever. Animals. Okay? And just as a representative to work with, let's just say that there's a shadow of a tree here. Okay? And let that tree, the shadow of the tree, represent all the shadows. Now, of course, because they've always been here, do they know that what they're looking at is a shadow? No. They have no basis for comparing what they see to anything else, because that's all they've ever seen. How much time do I have?
So far, so.
Okay, thank you. And of course, they become very adept at recognizing these shadows. Just like we are very savvy. We know how to get around. We can identify things easily. Okay? So one thing to remember is that this is not a matter of intelligence. Okay? It's a matter of what they have been exposed to. So what happens? Yeah. He's released.
Yeah.
Okay? And you've got to imagine that this is a traumatic experience. I mean, suddenly there's another being walking around here and untying me, and I've suddenly learned that I've got the power of mobility and that there are other people sitting next to me. And, well, he probably knew there were other people there, but not these guys behind him. So if he survives the shock of being untied, he turns around. And what does he see?
Fire.
Fire on.
Okay, for one thing, there's a fire back here, right? And between the fire and the cave wall is what?
It's like a walkway.
Some kind of walkway, a parapet, or a catwalk, okay? And walking back and forth along this catwalk are people carrying what?
Objects.
Objects or representations of everyday objects, like stone carvings, okay, or cardboard cutouts of trees and different kinds of animals. So here this guy is holding up at the moment this carving of a tree, and it's being cast on the wall. And maybe he'll put the tree down and he'll pick up, you know, the carving of a sheep, and he'll walk back and forth with it and go, bah, right? But when he discovers, when he looks at what's happening here, he sees that every time this guy moves the carving of the tree, the image on the wall moves in the same fashion. And he puts it together immediately. He realizes what? That this thing was not the real thing in the first place. That what he always thought was real is just a reflection of something else. This is the real thing. And furthermore, what makes it possible for this thing to generate an image of itself is the fire. Right? He sees the fire dancing and flickering, and that is causing the image to do the same. And as he looks at this fire, what happens?
It blinds his eyes.
Right.
It's not used to the.
Of course, you know, get up in the middle of the night, walk into a bright room, you're temporarily blinded. Okay? But you adjust. The pupils adjust to it. Now let me just ask you. That is the physical explanation of what just happened to the guy. But what is this pain in the eyes really about?
The real truths or the real understanding.
Yeah. Realizing that his entire life, as he's known it, has been a lie. Everything he thought was real was a sham. Okay? That's a hard pill to swallow. Now, one can't help, I think, the temptation to imagine that this is Socrates. Okay? Because a certain number of us at this point would probably be more than happy to run back over here, sit down, and pretend like it never happened. Okay? I mean, not only is it a lot to take in, that everything you've believed has been untrue, there's a degree of embarrassment that comes with that.
It's like waking up, find out you're adopted.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. All right, but he adjusts, this guy. Okay? But then what? He's brought outside, right? And when he gets outside, it's dramatically brighter. So he looks down. And when he looks down, he sees, again, a shadow of a tree. And sitting beside that shadow, let's say there's a pond, and in the pond is the reflection of a tree. Except this one is vibrant and vivid. It's got color, shimmering. Okay? And before long, his eyes begin to adjust. He looks up and he turns around, and behold, the living tree standing there. Now, what does he realize here?
In the true nature of the tree.
Okay. Okay. That perhaps he's realizing that, wait a minute. I like the way you put that. The true nature of the tree, or what is real about the tree, is not this representation of it, or this representation, or these, or maybe not even this, but that these are all reflections of the thing we call a tree. But he certainly does recognize that this reflection in the pond is superior to the shadow on the ground, right? Because it's colorful and it's, it's vibrant. Just as he recognized that the carving of the tree was superior to the shadow on the cave wall because it's three-dimensional. Okay? But when he stands next to this living tree and sees that it's got texture, sees that it's alive, perhaps he understands that this is the real tree and that these are copies, and that this also is a copy, just as the shadow on the wall is the copy of a copy. Okay? So this one is twice removed from the real tree. So think about this, right? Even though this shadow on the ground is just a shadow, it's just an absence of light. And perhaps this carving was very well done. Maybe it's a beautiful piece of art. Still, this shadow is closer to the real thing than this one is, because it's being cast by the thing itself. it is closer to the real tree than this one is. But you see, he gets it. He understands the difference between a thing and its reflection. He understands the concept of degrees. Then, of course, he remembers the fire and knows there must be a light source. So he looks up into the sky. And he sees the sun. But unlike the fire, he can't indefinitely stare into the sun. What do you think that represents?
The good.
Okay, we knew that. He told us from the beginning that the sun is metaphor for the good, right? But what does it say about the good? Yes, that first of all, I can't look at it directly. And second of all, an understanding of the good must be attempted in terms of its reflections. I cannot encounter it directly. It overwhelms the mind. It would blind us. Okay? So now the challenge is putting together the pieces here. The image of the line is meant to complement the cave. And we already know that the sun represents the good. Okay? So where do you want to start? You want to start at the opposite end? Because that's what makes sense. That makes sense to me. And believe me, there's a lot of scholars, 2,000 years of scholarship out there trying to put these two images together. And brilliant, creative ways of thinking about this thing.
Like matching all the words to the metaphor?
Right. If we know the good represents the sun, and we know that images are the lowest level of reality, then I suppose it makes sense to say that the shadow on the wall represents images, right? And if images presuppose physical objects, okay, maybe that's not an unreasonable leap to suggest that the stone carving here are the physical objects. And I think what supports this interpretation is the idea that within the cave is darkness. We are dwelling in the realm of shadow. Okay? So perhaps everything inside the cave represents the visible realm. Okay? And that even though this carving is obviously the origin of this reflection, it is not yet ultimately real. Because it's possible to go beyond, to ask about the origin of this carving. The artist who created this carving did so according to some standard, which presumably is the living tree. Okay. But now look, if inside the cave represents the visible realm, then what is the fire?
Like our sun.
Yes. That has to represent the sun. Which suggests something extraordinary. That the illumination provided by our sun is just a copy or a reflection of a domain of reality that is completely beyond our capacity to grasp. So if we are stepping out of the visible realm as we leave the cave and entering into the intelligible realm, and we already know that the good is represented by the sun, process of elimination, which suggests that this represents mathematics in some way. Go.
Wouldn't it be better for the fire to be represented as the moon? Because the sun basically is the real thing, and the moon reflects the light of the sun, which in turn reflects to the earth.
But then what's going to represent the sun for us here? Because we know that the original image was that our sun is going to stand in for the good. Okay? I like the way you're thinking, though. You're thinking philosophically.
It's the sun because it's still within our darkness, our visible realm.
Right. No matter how, even on the brightest day, our sun still belongs to the physical world and therefore is itself but a reflection. A reflection of what? Well, if you're Plato, a reflection of the good. Okay?
What about when you say that whole circle is mathematics? Maybe like all those reflections of the natural tree would be the mathematics?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Maybe the form, could the tree be a form though? Being a facet of the sun? I don't know. If that's...
I don't know. I suppose so. Remember, of course, the breakdown here is that in the story of the cave, once we leave the cave, we are still in the physical world dealing with a physical tree. Okay? But if the sun, from the very beginning, was the analog of the good, then we, of course, are reminded that we're just talking metaphorically here. And so, here's a way I would think about it. That these three, you see, ordinarily we would say that the physical tree is the real one. That's the real thing, and these are copies of it. But what Plato is trying to teach us is that even our physical world, even the real things in our world, are themselves just reflections. Okay? And ultimately, just appearances. So if I look at this living tree, and then I look at the shadow on the ground, and then I look at the reflection in the pond, what can I do? I can begin to extract what they have in common, what belongs to each of them that makes them members of the class of thing I call tree. Okay? What this teaches me is that a single equation or recipe can give rise to any number of things, just like a cookie cutter. I can stamp out as many cookies as I want, but they are all just copies of the original,
So,
the shape.
So just like any normal person, we can, like in essence, be the tree, right? Reflecting different parts of the good, whether it be justice or love. Like, is that like a social connection?
Yeah.
Because,
And again, this is so difficult.
Yeah, because if we can't exist without the good,
Right.
we're not able to express different facets of the good, right?
Yeah, you know, if things get really tricky if you start talking about something like, well, is there a form of a human being? Okay. And I guess there would have to be. So, the form of the tree, the form of a person, the form of justice, the form of anything you can think of, is just one way in which the good gives of itself. Okay? And again, to understand it, Plato has said, think about the way that the sun relates to everything else. We couldn't live without the sun, nor could we be seen without it. But we, just like the tree, just like the earth, all depend upon the existence of the sun. And of course, given the fact that everything that exists, all of the elements, are contained in stardust, anything that exists really is the offspring of that sun-like origin. Okay. All right, so when it comes time for quizzing you on this stuff, one thing that you want to keep in mind for sure is the ratio that images are to physical objects as mathematics are to forms, as the visible realm is to the intelligible realm. Okay? And I'm not likely to ask you to break down the cave in terms of the line to any great extent. Right? If I were to ask you something about how they relate, it would be something very obvious. Okay. But certainly keep this straight. Okay? Because I could ask you a lot of questions about this by way of analogy. Right? I could say forms are to mathematics as physical objects are to what? Images. Or I could say images are to physical objects as mathematics are to what? Or I could say mathematics are to forms as the visible realm is to what? Okay? You've got to keep this ratio in mind every time. Now you see, whether Plato meant that there is actually some realm of ideality, which is non-physical, or he simply meant to point out that thinking is idealistic, that we idealize, and that our understanding of what the ideal is can forever change. You know, that again is a matter of scholarship. But this image is so potent, you know, that and relevant that you continue to use it in order to express something basic about philosophy as an art form. Because let me ask you this. Let's assume for a second, I don't have to assume this. Let's go with what we know. We aren't in a cave. Okay? We aren't looking at shadows on a wall. So what is he actually trying to teach us here?
It's all about perspective.
Process of learning is tough.
That's
Okay.
why.
All these things, you know,
That we don't have a choice.
learning.
Well,
Is-
he went back, right? He went back to tell the others about what he saw,
Okay, let's start with that.
and then after that, he tried to teach them, and they said that you're a fool. That's not reality. This
Right.
is it.
Once this guy makes it out of the cave, all right, the last thing he's going to want to do
Go back.
is go back in and sit down. He's going to want to explore this new world. But he is made to go back inside. He is sent back in to teach the others. Okay? And while, of course, he wants to share this, he'd probably much rather be spending his time, whatever time he has left, in the light of truth. But he goes back out of a sense of duty. Okay? Now let's think about Socrates. When Socrates spends his time trying to tell us that we have mistaken something that only appears to be real and good for the real thing, it gets him killed. And what do you suppose these folks in here are going to do when this lunatic comes back into the cave ranting and raving about how none of this stuff is real, how there's a whole other world out there, especially when coming back into the cave will have it's going to do the same thing to your eyes that leaving the cave did, right? When you move from light to darkness, it blinds you again. So not only is he talking like a lunatic, he's stumbling around the place, he's bumping into things, he can't recognize the shadows on the wall anymore, not just because his eyes haven't yet adjusted, but because he doesn't care about them anymore. He is no longer one of these people. He has changed. Okay? They're gonna first say, just, you can believe what you want, but leave us alone. But when he persists and won't let them go, eventually they're going to want to kill him. Okay? I think probably one of the most important questions we can raise about this is, if we're not really in a cave being held captive by some mysterious shadow government or something, what does this captivity really represent?
Prison.
What kind of imprisonment?
We're limited to what we
Prison in the mind.
Yes. The prisons of our own making. When we attach to ideas that we haven't really thought about. So the ability to stand up. There were never any shackles holding this guy. The shackles is our fear of the unknown. The ability to stand up and turn around is the first act of philosophical bravery. This is philosophical courage. The courage to subject your long-held beliefs to analysis. This is self-examination. And even though, of course, it is a metaphor and it comes to an end here, because I can never look directly into the sun, it is suggested that this process is endless. There's always another aspect, a slightly different way of looking at things. Somebody earlier said that, you've got to remember that reality always, to some extent, is a matter of perspective. None of us can see things from a purely objective point of view. Okay? We're all here together. Which, by the way, is something extraordinary in itself. If you think about the history of the universe, however old it is, 11.5 billion years, right? The age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years. History of human beings as we know them, which is about 200,000 years. And the fact that you and I should be existing in the same time frame amidst all of that, and be living in the same region and sitting in the same classroom, the odds against that are unbelievable. And yet we all come from slightly different backgrounds, right? We're looking at a 2,000-year-old idea, and we each come to it with our own history, our own trauma, our own experiences. And so what you get out of this is going to be personal to you. And that's why it's, Plato endures. It's very easy to say, well, this is what Plato meant and that's it. But it is always possible just to turn the lens slightly, and the whole thing looks different.